Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Fullest podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Elizabeth Cohen, who's a clinical psychologist breaking the stigma of divorce. She's the CEO and founder of the online divorce course and membership Afterglow, the light at the other side of divorce. She's also the CEO of the Center for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy in New York City. Dr. Cohen's online course teaches women how to heal, grow, and thrive after divorce, no matter how difficult the process has been. Dr. Cohen received her PhD in clinical psychology from Boston University and was the recipient of the prestigious American Psychological Foundation Research Award for her research on the emotional effects of 9/11. I could go on, but I'm so excited to hear directly from you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Nikki, for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I think it's such an important conversation. It's something that happens to, I would say, most of our society. And I mean, I would say, I don't know what the percentage is. I'm sure you know, but either, someone's gone through a divorce or they kind of like cancer, right? Or someone who's gone through it in the family. And so it's really, really prominent, and we're not really discussing the effects on people and their family members. And I'm interested in it because my parents have had a discussion around divorce with I have one sibling. So my sister and I were aware that they were not happy in their relationship ever since we were little. And they tried separating so many times. It was like really difficult. I mean, it continues to be really difficult. So when I found out about your book and everything, I was like, oh, I think it'd be really fun to have her on, because for me, it was like I was 5 or 6 and I knew that my parents wanted to separate, but they felt bad, I think, because of my sister and I, and for me, I would just cry and say, no, please don't. And then they didn't. And so I was like, oh, great, they're not going to because of me. But obviously the result of that was growing up in a household that was really volatile and felt like a war zone constantly. And to be honest, it literally hasn't ended. There was a period where I thought it ended, and then they've been in a 15-year court battle.
Wow.
So it's a really intense divorce, and it's feels like it's about to end. So that's nice. But it's been interesting, the effects of it.
And Nikki, your situation is not unusual, sadly. Many people have grown up in homes where parents thought they were helping the kids by not divorcing and not splitting up. And what really gets missed in that circumstance is what you described so painfully, which is the sense of insecurity and lack of safety that comes from living in a house with people arguing, or even if they're not arguing, because I hear that a lot. Well, we don't argue, cold shoulder, icing people out, not holding hands, not connecting, not living with your partner as your best friend. That impacts children. And I get the fear that divorce is going to really screw up the kids. I have a whole course that I teach on that, how not to screw up your kids. I get that. But honestly, you have to think further along. What is the impact of someone who's had to live with this level of hostility? How does it impact your kids' sense of safety? How does it impact how they see relationships? That also has a huge impact. And I think we get really lost, in this idea of we shouldn't divorce. And I don't think about all the effects that you are so open and honestly sharing right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting dynamic too, because as a child, then you think you can control the situation by saying no, or I'm gonna, or try and be better, or whatever.
Well, because the way children's brains are developed are that we are self-referential. because we need to understand how to control our environment. And so if something happens, we automatically think, how can I make this better? What can I do to change the situation? So even though your parents might say, this is not about you, this is about us, internally and in your nervous system as a child, you think, if I was just smarter, funnier, quieter, whatever it might be, fill in the word, then this might not be happening. And so you take on way more responsibility than kids need to. I think about this in my second marriage. My children, they do not think about how I'm doing or worry about my relationship or worry about my feelings. It's not their job. And so that's a gift I can give them, to not be preoccupied with what's happening in my life.
Yeah. And I think that's really amazing that you know that. Obviously, it's also as part of just your profession. And I'm sure you've done so much work on yourself. But with my parents, it's like, oh, you don't understand where I'm coming from. This is why, and it's just like, and I think exactly that. It's like you are, as a child, put in a situation where you just have to grow up really fast. And for me, I ended up meeting my husband in high school, like when it got really bad with my parents. And we've been together ever since, and have created and we both come from, like you said, it is very common how long it can go on in the court system. And especially when attorneys are like feeding off of the family's emotional drama and like
Totally.
continuing the battle because it benefits them. It doesn't benefit them to end anything. And
Exactly.
so my husband actually, like, his parents went through a very similar situation, and it was just ending when we met. And so we just like totally bonded and like each other and are doing things so differently. And I'm grateful because I think part of probably your work too is helping heal women, and anyone, I'm assuming, could pick up your book and feel that they could heal and thrive after divorce, and therefore teach their children have better, healthier habits, and that will then in turn affect their future relationships. So I'm
Absolutely.
grateful that I was able to just kind of have an awareness around it that was different. But I think that it is really crazy. I mean, I know, so I have family members that are going through it, and I'm watching their children, and I'm like, oh my God, that was me when I was little. And the parents are like going at it and manipulating each other and like trying to get custody just because out of
Right.
spite, and it's so insane. So, and then also like my own family situation, I now that it's like really coming to an end, that's what I was like really interested about with your book as well,
Yeah.
is because I think that it's been so long that, at least for my mother, I literally think that, I mean, this is obviously super personal, but I just am really personal on this podcast. But like, I really think that she's scared for it to end at this point because it's been so long and such a big part of her identity. And so
Yeah.
it's so wonderful that you have, compiled all this work and shared it with people. And I'm curious what inspired you to do it. And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right about your mom. There are ways in which divorce can really become a job. It's something that has taken up so much of her heart, her mind, her soul. And so definitely there's going to be a transition period. And in a lot of ways, by not letting go, by holding on to the rage, by not processing your feelings, you hold on to the person, even if you don't want to actually be with the person. So there's this real kind of clinging that happens. And that's why I think people, fight for custody, even if they don't want it or don't want to agree to Christmas or to Hanukkah, like to these pieces that people don't want to just release. And the premise of my book is, if you do the exercises in the book, if you read the book, then you will heal yourself. And by healing yourself, then you can release the relationship and see it as having given you everything you possibly needed. That we need to release it before we can move through.
This week's episode is sponsored by Odama, which is tomato spelled backwards. Founded in 2018 when entrepreneur and foodie Andrew Suzuka created a flavorful sauce his picky eater daughter just couldn't get enough of, Odama is the perfect way to add a nutritious boost to your family's go-to meals. If you've ever tried looking for an organic tomato sauce, you will know just how difficult it is to come by, because tomatoes are typically found to have high levels of pesticides and herbicides, which is why I'm so happy to have finally found and able to share with you all a trusted brand that can be purchased in a pinch at your local Whole Foods store. It's also available in a fiber-rich and dairy-free vodka sauce. And as always, we love sharing special promotions just for our fullest fam. So for 10% off your order at odamontfoods.com, use code THEFULLEST at checkout. I think that's so beautiful. And it's been such a common thread that through different professionals and doctors that I've interviewed, whether it's on parenting or regarding this divorce or anything, it really comes back to when we work with ourselves, when we're more mindful, when we have self-care, when we feel more connected with ourselves, then it just automatically reflects and shows in the different areas of our life. So it automatically helps us heal these other issues or that we're seeing. And I love that your book offers that perspective.
Yeah, it does. And
I just want to say, I think in divorce, especially, I mean, with being a parent, right? That's going to help, but at the same time, maybe a parent is on some level at least aware that their kid is just a kid. And so it's easier to accept that, okay, I need to do something different or take responsibility. But when you're in a divorce, I think it's just so difficult to come out of that victimhood and blaming. So it's really just a really different perspective to take.
Yeah. I mean, I think also that you mentioned the court system earlier. The court system doesn't really encourage people to reflect. It encourages them to collect data and evidence against the other person. So luckily, I work with people who are mediators and lawyers who do believe that you need to work with someone like me or read my book before you do any work, that external work, that you need to do the internal work so you can show up for yourself really and your children from a place of, as you said, beautifully grounded, present, so that you can make good decisions. And, I came to this work, honestly. I was divorced about 10 years ago. I had a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old when I asked my ex-husband to leave. And I wrote this book because I have had so many nights where I, would Google divorce recovery and couldn't find anything. And would just be laying there thinking, okay, I guess I'm not going to recover because there's no book about it. And so it was really important to me to write a book that used my clinical experience, my personal experience to help people know that it's called Light at the Other Side of Divorce, that there is light after the pain, but that you have to be willing to look at yourself. You have to be willing to figure out how, with deep compassion, what do I need to do and what do I need to change? There was a moment of my life where I was at the playground with my young kids and people asked me about my prior husband. And I started telling these pretty gory stories. We had a lot. He suffered from the disease of alcoholism. And so I had a lot of, really terrible stories. And after I left that, while they had been, so compassionate and so understanding, I felt terrible. And I thought to myself, am I going to do this for the rest of my life? I remember exactly where I was walking in the park and I thought, wait a minute, I could either continue to tell his story and these stories forever, or I could figure out how did I end up here and how do I make sure I don't do it again? Because my life is not over. This isn't the end of my life. What can I learn from this? And that was really the beginning of my journey.
I love that you had that perspective and insight, that it just didn't make you feel good to talk about it. I think I'm sure some people, they just need to share their emotions, and maybe they don't have access to a therapist or good friends or family or whatever. But in that situation, it's just makes so much sense to say, wow, why do I need to continue reflecting on it and sharing that and not moving forward. So then you decided from there, I'm going to work on why I ended up in that relationship in the first place.
Exactly. And for me, it wasn't anymore about that person's addiction. It was how I was okay for so long pretending it wasn't happening or enabling it, or kind of why I felt comfortable, to be honest, with someone who was under functioning. What was I, while I was telling these stories of all the things he didn't do and how he didn't help the family and all of those things, I was getting something out of it. There was something that was feeding my ego because I was so together. And I thought, oof, that's a bad way to feel good about yourself, is by being with someone who isn't doing that well. And so I had to really look at that part of my personality and my approach. And I needed to start learning how to speak up for myself. I needed to start practicing sharing how I felt instead of just criticizing somebody either to their face or behind their back. And it wasn't until I allowed myself the possibility and started actually looking for men, as I am heterosexual, who were humble, that I even knew that it existed. And then that became the number one trait that I was looking for. I talk about this in the book, about how to kind of come up with your deal breakers. And when I met my current husband, who is, my best friend and a wonderful partner, what first struck me about him was how his humility, his ability to be present with me. To be honest, he didn't have to be the life of the party, which was kind of what I was attracted to before, but he was present and saw me. And so those are the kinds of things that I looked at to figure out how to do it differently.
Do you think that why do you think most people get divorced to begin with? Do you think it's a little ancestral, or maybe not ancestral, but like personal shit, basically? Or do you think that, and I'm sure it's a combination, as it always is, but like a society, and like I'm sure certain geographic locations just have more higher divorce rates, and so I'm sure you've looked into that.
Yeah, so there's a few things I think that are at play. The first thing is that we put such immense pressure on relationships in our culture. Even the concept of marriage, I talk in the book about, we all have someone who's, you think don't end up like, Aunt Judy, who never got married and has 17 cats. And I talk about, well, maybe Aunt Judy's happy not being married, right? There's this pressure, especially for women, that you have to be in a relationship to be successful or to have arrived or to be seen as achieving anything. And that's a huge misconception. I mean, there's so many other ways to measure your worth beyond relationships. So I think part of it is the pressure people have to be in a relationship. So then if something is not going right in the relationship and you end it, we don't see it as like a perfect ending, like you decide to leave your job. We see it as a shame or a failure. So I think that's one piece. The second piece is, I think we just aren't taught in our world how to communicate effectively and openly. So things get difficult. Shit gets hard in relationships. Like, I have a wonderful partner and we struggle at times. But the difference between us and a relationship that kind of can't last is that we communicate about it. Maybe not in the moment, maybe not in the most beautiful way, but we are dedicated to moving through it. Similarly with the divorce, I think, are you holding on to resentment? Are you wanting to show that the other person is wrong? Or are you willing to communicate about your role in this? What are you wanting? What are you bringing to it? And I think we're just not taught that. Kids take home ec still in some places and learn how to build a table, but they don't learn how to have effective communication. So I think that's one of the big problems with why we have divorce as well.
And then with that, why is it so high in certain geographic locations, would you say?
I actually don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah. I mean, I've noticed I live in Orange County, and it's like way higher here than where I went to college, which was in Oregon. And it was like, oh, I grew up with like everyone whose parents were divorced. And then I went to college and like none of my friends' parents were divorced. And I thought that was so interesting. And like, I just figured it's because probably there's like outside I don't know. But I mean, people, who knows, maybe they're more likely to cheat. I don't cheat or something because it's more, what is it, tempting? And I don't know. Just what I thought
Yeah,
that.
I wonder. That's a good question about whether like urban areas are more likely to have, divorce than rural areas. I mean, I think one thing that's just popping into my mind, Nikki, is that, one of the things that does prevent people from getting divorced, I have a couple women who are working in my program now who are from very small towns. And so I think if you're like maybe in New York where I live, where you can be more, there's more anonymity. You're not like running into someone at the grocery store every day asking you like, where's your husband? Or, it might be if you can have more anonymity, if it's a bigger place, maybe you feel more comfortable doing that. Whereas if you're from a smaller town, people are always going to kind of be in your business a little more potentially.
That makes so much sense. So it's not necessarily maybe that some people are just happier in those areas that have less rates of divorce. It's maybe the fact that they're afraid of doing it to begin with because that's their community. Such a great perspective. I didn't think about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so going back to like the effect on children, I mean, you mentioned like no one is responsible, just the perspective of like knowing that no one else is responsible for my emotions other than myself. And so not placing that on your children. But I'm curious what other things you recommend while parents are going through stuff like this to help their kids cope or just kind of not repeat patterns, right?
Yeah, great question. I think there are two things that I'd really like to highlight. The first is that it's so important to acknowledge that you are going through a traumatic experience when you have a divorce. And so your emotions, your ability to process feelings, your ability to cope, your ability to tolerate uncertainty is really challenged. And so you are going to be very sensitive and have more heightened triggers. So when your child comes to you with something, like they come back from their other parent's house and they tell you, oh my God, my other parent was so frustrating. I got so angry because they weren't listening to me, for example. In that moment, you have to take a moment and say, what is about me and what is about my kid? Because you might, for example, feel like, I know your other parent never listened to me. They never listen. That's one of their problems. And all of those things might be true. Okay. But that's your shit with your ex. What is this kid trying to tell you? And what do you need to give your kid? What we need to give children in general is to feel like they're being heard and validated. They don't need any extra information from us. So a response to a kid saying, oh, I feel so frustrated that my parent didn't listen to me. You could say, wow, you were so frustrated. How did that feel? What did you do? What do you want to do? Right? You just are like a curious reporter or a therapist. You're not adding any of your stuff to it. Lots of parents, understandably, and in my book, I have a chapter called Righteous Anger, have anger at their other partner. That makes perfect sense. It's not for your kid to know, to feel, or even to experience, because your kid needs a relationship and actually has a biological nervous system program of attachment to be attached to that parent. If they start feeling like you're talking smack about that other parent, they are ultimately going to feel unsafe and insecure. And I don't know, Nikki, if you want to talk about your experience with this, but it is definitely going to make them feel unsure. They need to feel connected to both parents. So it's so important when your kid comes to you and says something negative about their other parent, for you to just be curious and listen and not to put your other stuff on it. So that's the first thing. But Nikki, if you want to comment on that, I can tell you the second.
I mean, I would say in my situation, it was, I didn't have any complaints about my parents when I was younger, or like my dad was at work a lot. So when I was with my mom at home, she would just complain constantly, or I would hear her talk about him to her friends. And I would get so offended. And so really what it did was actually like push me away more because I'd be like, that's my dad. And he,
Exactly.
yeah, and he's such a good dad, right? So like I understood why he may not have been like the best husband to her, even though I think like they were just, whatever. They just had separate agendas in life and they weren't compatible. But like to me, I was like, he's literally the best dad ever. So like, I can't believe that you're saying this about this person.
Exactly. And I say, I'm so glad you said this, Nikki, because I tell clients this all the time. You are literally driving them into the other parent's like arms when you say that, because children need to be connected and allied to both parents. I'm sure you see that with your child. Like they need both. And so they are not going to come on your side. And if they are coming on your side, that is not good. That is making them feel like they have to be pulled between an impossible situation. And the second thing I want to say is that it's really important for you to understand that your kid sees themselves as 50% you and 50% them, the other person. So if you do talk smack about the other person, there is a moment when they are going to say, wait a minute, I'm like that parent too. Does mom hate me? Am I like that? Like all of these characteristics. So it's really important for everyone to think about one or two positive characteristics about your ex-partner. And this can be, what you fell in love with, what you maybe you like you see that they could be sometimes, even if it's not what you like, and reflect to your kids from now and again when you see that in them. So for example, in my situation, my ex-husband is quite curious and quite funny. And so whenever my kids are being really curious, I'll say, wow, you have such a deep curiosity for things and you love to find answers. That reminds me of that amazing characteristic of your dad. Because in that moment, I'm saying something positive about the dad. So I'm not, crapping on him. And it's also true, by the way, it's not just fake. And I'm helping them see that that they have parts of them that are him that are positive.
I love that. And I want to share that my sister had the opposite experience of me where she has very similar characteristics as my mom. And so my dad, as she got older and as like their divorce got worse, would be like, oh, you're just like your mom. When, he would essentially get, what would happen is, and I'm sure this is really like what it comes down to, is he gets triggered, I think. And because now as a woman with a kid and all that, I think she really does trigger him sometimes and reminds him of my mom. But it's really sad because we both kind of like, I have very similar interests as my mom. So I kind of like, that's what kept our relationship going, is like, we like to do the same things. And my sister and my dad like to do the same things. But in terms of like who we feel more comfortable with, like it's definitely, I'm closer with my dad and she's closer with my mom. And so it's been really difficult for her. And it's really sad to see because he like, I think he's aware that he shouldn't say anything, but I don't think he says it as often, but I can even tell continues to get triggered. Or she probably gets triggered by me. I've like held up some boundaries that I've needed over the last year, but like, I know that this is something that's probably a lifelong thing. It's not something that's just going to go away unless obviously they're going to continue to work on themselves, hopefully, and try and see why they get triggered and whatnot. But I think at the end of the day, there's layers to healing and like you're going to get triggered. So I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're bringing up such a good point. I mean, I think that I know from in my situation, when my son was younger, anytime he would act out of control, I would think, oh my gosh, he's going to, struggle with the disease of alcoholism. Like I just assumed he was going to be like my husband, or whenever he did anything negative. And I remember my therapist saying to me, he's 8, like he's acting like an 8-year-old, like someone who struggles with the disease of alcoholism is an adult acting like an 8-year-old, but he is an 8-year-old. And so I had to keep checking myself, and I still do. There's a way that my son will, and maybe this happens in your family, will kind of sound like his dad. Like he'll just have this intonation, and I can just feel my body go into fight, flight, or freeze, and just feel really as if he's sitting across from me, especially because my son is now 15 and way taller than me and probably taller than his dad. And I think I have to ground myself and think, this is now. That was then, this is now. He's this kid. My ex is someone else. I have to constantly do what we do in somatic experiencing for trauma, is just remind ourselves that this is now and that was then. Really separating out the two people, and because a trigger can happen so quickly.
Wow. Yeah. And like you said, it's when they get older, right? Because then it's like more resemblances
Exactly.
and visually, and there's just so many components. And yeah, I think what's also interesting that I wanted to touch on, and I mentioned this, so my sister and I almost took sides, right? And we've been like working on our relationship a lot, so that because we're aware of it, and like we're aware of how the family dynamic kind of played out as kids. But with that feels like we're in a like battle too. And we've taken on our parents' like stuff, and we kind of get triggered by those same things. And it's interesting how that pattern has repeated in our relationship as siblings. And really what we've noticed is obviously a lot of the arguments come down to like her feeling that a lack of love from my dad and vice versa, right? So I think that it's really interesting how your relationship with your spouse can just easily be imprinted onto your children, and siblings can have that similar relationship.
Nikki, I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because I haven't really talked about this, and you're so right. It's such an insightful point. And I think it's a very kind of subtle message that people miss, because when people are going through divorce, and you saw this with your parents, they're so absorbed with themselves. That's part of why I did this book, is to help people become like a little bit less absorbed with themselves in this preoccupied way, that they don't notice the subtle ways that they're impacting people around them. And I think you bring up such a good point. And I have a situation in my family where my parents really should have gotten divorced and never did. And that has been really terrible and awful for years. And I don't know, maybe that's why I also wrote this book. And my sister and I both had, one of us was allied with either parent. And it has, you're right, for me too, it has taken a while for us to be able to come together without kind of carrying like our parents' torches, is how I feel. Like they're always with us when we're talking in some way, the one I'm allied with and the one she's allied with. And it's really important. I mean, sibling relationships are hugely important as to support each other. So you're impacting how your kids get along with each other. And of course, it also impacts romantic relationships. So I think you and your sister are so lucky to have each other and be willing to talk about the triggers and be willing to talk about what's coming up for both of you. I think it probably happens in many families, and they don't talk about it. Such a good point.
Yeah, we've been really lucky to have the opportunity to really explore that. I mean, we've been in therapy for so long, right? So I think that at some point we found the right people to help us, because it's definitely a long journey, and I think you really have to find the right person. And again, like I think it's been layers and layers, and we were young and going through our own stuff, but now we have our own families, and so we're able to recognize that we don't want those patterns to be imprinted onto our own kids. And so I feel really blessed to also just be part of this community, this wellness community, and be doing the work. And I that's why I really wanted to talk to you, because I think it's so beautiful. A lot of times when I talk to people, it's really picking up one person's book that changed their life, right? And I think writing from your experience and from your clinical experience as well is just so important, and can help so many people. And as you saw, there really aren't very many resources out there. And so I think part of the trap of the court system and just everything that goes along with divorce, it's so hard as a child to see your parents go through, and it's also hard for everyone to go through. And so your work is just more important than ever. And I'm curious if you could share kind of, I know you have an online course. So I think, some people are more about, okay, I picked up this book, it changed my life, and I just did it.
Yeah.
Because you just like intuitively know you just need to do it. Or some people are more about online courses. So tell us if they work together or whatnot.
Yeah. So I have an online course that helps guide you through healing through divorce. I mean, again, just like you said, some people like to listen to audiobooks, some people like to read the book, right? It's a different format of learning the information. There's also an opportunity there to circle with me. So to get some calls with me, which is an added bonus. And then once people do the course, I also have a membership program. So we have a group of women who meet, who have different stages of divorce, who deeply support each other. It's the most inspiring group. And we have coaching sessions with me. We have experts come in and talk about divorce. We have lots of connecting time there. So that's another opportunity to work with me.
Amazing. I wish that my parents could have worked with you, but we'll see how.
Me too.
I really appreciate you coming on and sharing about your work and hearing my personal story as well. I haven't really actually shared it on the podcast before, but because we live in California too, I think the court system here is just really interesting, and so I've really gone deep into like this whole thing because I feel that it's prevented my parents from moving on. And so I think it plays such a big role in it. And I think hopefully by people finding your work, they can see that, they can take the responsibility to just not allow the system to work them, essentially. And that's why I really wanted to share it as well. So thank you for coming on and sharing with me.